The day Alice Boone walked into the Caldwell Creek town, meeting with her chin raised and her boots resolute against the warped wooden floorboards, every man in that room stopped breathing for just a moment. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because a woman had never dared to cross that threshold before. And the year was 1882, and Caldwell Creek, Kansas, was not a town known for its hospitality toward those who defied its unspoken rules. She had ridden 3 miles from her homestead that morning under a sky so wide and blue it almost hurt to look at, her dark hair pinned beneath a weathered hat, her dress the color of dried sage, practical and unadorned. She had not come to be admired. She had come because the water rights dispute that old Harlan Dukes had been waging against every small farmer south of the creek was about to ruin everything she had built in the 4 years since her husband Thomas had died of a fever and left her with 40 acres, a mule named Biscuit, and 2 small children. Her son Eli, who was 7, and her daughter Me, who had just turned 5. The meeting hall was a converted feed store that smelled of sawdust and old tobacco. Rows of rough-hewn benches were filled with ranchers and merchants and the occasional farmer, all men, all wearing expressions that ranged from curious to outright hostile as Alice chose a seat in the middle of the room rather than slipping to the back where she might have been tolerated as an observer. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back perfectly straight, and she waited. Sheriff Clement Purdy, a broad man with a drooping mustache and the kind of authority that had never once been seriously challenged, stood at the front of the room beside a crude map tacked to the wall. He cleared his throat 3 times before he began speaking, and even then his eyes kept sliding toward Alice with the particular discomfort of a man who does not know what to do with something that doesn't fit into his established world. "Gentlemen," he said, emphasizing the word in a way that was clearly meant to render Alice invisible by sheer linguistic will, "we are gathered here today to settle the matter of the water rights to Caldwell Creek as pertains to the usage downstream. Mr. Harlan Dukes has filed a legal claim asserting prior appropriation rights dating back to 1871, and his attorneys in Wichita have drawn up papers that would effectively limit the drawing rights of all properties south of the Dukes Ranch boundary line." A murmur went through the room like a wind through dry grass. Harlan Dukes sat in the front row, as large and immovable as a granite outcropping, his gray suit costing more than most of the men in the room earned in a month. He had thick white sideburns and small eyes that calculated everything they looked at in terms of profit and leverage. Beside him sat his attorney, a thin man from Wichita named Prescott who wore a collar so stiff it appeared to be fighting his neck. Several men immediately began talking at once. Old Pete Garrity, who ran a pig operation south of town, shouted that Dukes had no right to the creek because the creek had been there before Dukes's grandfather ever set foot on Kansas soil. Ben Cartwright, the miller, argued about water levels from the previous summer. Reverend Doyle, who had a small vegetable garden behind the church that he'd apparently decided made him an agricultural stakeholder, quoted something that may or may not have been scripture. And then Alice raised her hand. Nobody saw it at first. She raised it higher. Sheriff Purdy saw it and visibly flinched. He looked away. He called on Ben Cartwright again, who was already talking. She kept her hand raised. It was at this precise moment that Stephen Haskins, seated at the far right end of the third bench, turned and saw her. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from genuine labor rather than affectation, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water on a cloudy day, a kind of gray-green that shifted depending on the light. He had come to the meeting because he ran cattle on the acreage east of town, and the water rights dispute affected his operation as well, though less dramatically than it affected the smaller farms. He was not the richest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He had spent the first 15 minutes of the meeting listening carefully and saying nothing, which was unusual enough that 2 of his neighbors had already checked to make sure he was awake. He saw Alice's hand, raised with a patience that was somehow more forceful than all the shouting around her, and something shifted in his chest that he would not be able to name for quite some time. He did not look away. Sheriff Purdy called on Pete Garrity again. Pete Garrity said everything he had already said, slightly louder. Alice's hand remained raised. Dukes's attorney Prescott began shuffling papers in a way that suggested he was preparing a lengthy legal recitation, and the sheriff looked relieved at the prospect of something technical enough to consume the rest of the afternoon. Stephen Haskins stood up. The room did not exactly go quiet, but it shifted, the way a conversation shifts when something unexpected enters it. "Sheriff Purdy," Stephen said, his voice carrying without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to making himself heard across open land, "there is a woman in this room who has had her hand raised for the better part of 10 minutes. It seems to me that basic courtesy, if nothing else, ought to extend to letting her speak." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room that has been called on something it would have preferred to ignore. Sheriff Purdy opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Alice, looked at Stephen, looked at the assembled men, several of whom were now looking at Alice with expressions that ranged from resigned to reluctantly intrigued. "Mrs. Boone," the sheriff said finally, the words coming out as though they cost him something, "you may say your piece." Alice was already standing before he finished the sentence. She did not thank him. She did not begin with an apology for her presence, as he had perhaps expected. She looked out at the room with those steady brown eyes of hers, and she spoke in a voice that was clear and measured and absolutely without tremor. "My name is Alice Boone. I own the 40-acre property at the southern end of Caldwell Creek, the one that Thomas Boone filed on in 1878. I have 2 children. I have a small wheat crop, a kitchen garden, and 2 milking cows. All of it depends entirely on water access from that creek. Mr. Dukes's proposed restriction would limit my drawing rights to a level that would make it impossible to sustain either the crop or the animals, and I would like to know what legal basis exists for allowing one man to effectively destroy the livelihoods of every small farmer downstream of his property for the purpose of expanding his own cattle operation." She paused. 3 men started to respond simultaneously. "I am not finished," Alice said, and there was something in her tone, not loud, not angry, just absolutely certain, that stopped all 3 of them cold. "What Mr. Dukes is proposing is not simply a water rights matter. It is an economic consolidation. If the small farms south of town are forced out, and they will be if this restriction passes, their properties become available for purchase at distressed prices. I have looked at the land registry, and I have noticed that Mr. Dukes has expressed purchase interest in 3 of those properties in the past 18 months. I am suggesting that this meeting ask itself whether it is deciding a water rights question, or whether it is deciding whose future this town belongs to." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Stephen Haskins had not taken his eyes off her for the entirety of her speech. He had not interrupted. He had not shifted in his seat. He had listened the way a man listens when he knows he is hearing something true. Around him, the room began to buzz again. Harlan Dukes's face had gone the color of old brick. The attorney Prescott was leaning close to his ear, whispering rapidly. Several of the men who had been dismissive were now talking among themselves with expressions that suggested they were recalculating something. Sheriff Purdy called the meeting to order again, twice, before it settled into something resembling organized discussion. The Duke's proposal did not pass that afternoon. It was tabled for further review, which in practical terms meant that the pressure from the assembled small farmers, newly galvanized by Alice's intervention, had made it politically uncomfortable to push through immediately. It was not a complete victory. It was the beginning of one. When the meeting adjourned and the room began to empty into the late afternoon light, Alice was gathering her hat from her seat when she became aware that someone was standing nearby. Not crowding her, not imposing, just present in the way that a person can be when they are waiting to see if their presence is welcome. She looked up. Stephen Haskins was holding his own hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not the expression she had received from most of the room, which varied between resentment and reluctant admiration. His expression was quieter than either of those things. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "I'm Stephen Haskins. I run cattle east of town." "I know who you are," Alice said, which was not entirely true. She knew of him in the general way that people in a small community know of one another by sight and reputation, but something made her say it anyway, perhaps because she was tired of being the person in the room that everyone else knew about while she remained a stranger. "What you said in there was important," Stephen told her. "And it was true. I should have thought to look at the land registry myself." He paused. "I didn't interrupt you." She studied him. "No, you did not. I wanted to, twice. There were things I thought of that might have added to the point." He paused again. "But I thought you were making the point better than I would have made it for you. And it seemed to me that a woman who's been managing a farm alone for 4 years, and who walked into that room knowing what she was walking into, probably didn't need me to finish her sentences." Alice Boone, who had been preparing some version of a polite dismissal since he had first said her name, stopped preparing it. "That is," she said carefully, "a surprisingly reasonable observation for a man who was sitting in that room." Something shifted in his expression, a shadow of what might have been amusement, but it was the serious kind of amusement, the kind that doesn't undercut the thing that preceded it. "Can I walk you to your horse, Mrs. Boone?" She considered him for a moment. The light was long and golden through the dusty windows, and outside she could hear the town settling into its evening sounds, the distant complaint of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels on the main street. "Yes," she said, "you may." They walked out of the feed store and into the full weight of the Kansas evening, the sky above them gone to copper and rose along the western horizon, the air carrying that particular end-of-summer heat that feels almost like tenderness. She had tied Biscuit the mule to the post outside, and he regarded Stephen with the mule's customary expression of philosophical skepticism as they approached. "Fine animal," Stephen said. "He is not," Alice replied. "He is stubborn, he bites if you come at him from the left, and he has no appreciation for urgency. But he is consistent, and in my experience consistency is worth more than I used to give it credit for." "That sounds like something you came to believe the hard way." She looked at him sideways. "Most things worth believing are." He untied Biscuit for her and held the lead while she mounted, and she was aware of the fact that he did it without making a production of it, without the exaggerated helpfulness that was really a form of condescension, just a practical assistance offered because it was practical. "Mr. Haskins," she said, once she was up and had gathered the reins, "why did you stand up in there? You have cattle east of town. The Duke's proposal affects you, but not the way it affects the small farms. You didn't need to say anything on my behalf." He looked up at her, one hand still resting easy on Biscuit's neck, and the sun was behind him now, and she could not quite make out the full detail of his expression, but she could hear the steadiness in his voice. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, "and because you had your hand raised for 10 minutes and nobody was willing to see it, and I am not the kind of man who can watch that happen and stay in his seat." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was probably necessary. "Good evening, Mr. Haskins," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Boone." She rode home with the copper sky arching overhead and Biscuit steady, unimpressed plodding beneath her, and she thought about the meeting and the water rights and the things she would need to do next, the letters she would write to the county land office, the conversations she would have with the other small farmers, the careful political work of building something that might actually hold against Harlan Dukes's money and attorneys. She thought about all of that. And underneath all of it, like a current below the surface of a river, she thought about a man who had listened without interrupting, and whose eyes were the color of creek water, and who had untied her mule without making it mean anything more or less than it was. She told herself that was not important. She told herself that several times on the ride home. Eli and me were at the kitchen table when she arrived, supervised by their neighbor Mrs. Clara Webb, a widow of 62 with strong opinions about everything, and an absolute reliability in a crisis that Alice had come to depend on completely. Clara had made biscuits and there was a pot of beans on the stove, and Eli immediately began demanding to know what had happened at the meeting, because Eli at 7 was already deeply invested in the concept of justice in a way that both moved and exhausted Alice regularly. The proposal was tabled, Alice told him, washing her hands at the basin. Does that mean we win? It means we have more time to make our case properly. Eli considered this with a 7-year-old's instinct for the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of incomplete victories. That doesn't sound like winning. That is because you are 7 years old, Alice said, and winning usually looks very different from what you imagine when you are 7 years old. Me, who had inherited her father's red hair and her mother's stubbornness in equal measure, looked up from the drawing she was making with a stick of charcoal. Did any men be mean to you? A few were impolite, Alice said carefully, but one was quite decent. She had not meant to say that last part. It arrived in the sentence before she made a deliberate decision to include it, which was itself a thing she noted and set aside for later consideration. Clara Webb, who was folding dish towels in the corner and who had ears like a barn cat, looked up with an expression of maximum interest that she very professionally kept at a casual angle. "Oh," Clara said, in the tone of a woman who has decided she is not going to say another word and is therefore going to allow the silence to work for her. "He kept me from being talked over," Alice said, firmly closing that particular avenue of conversation. "It was courtesy, nothing more." "Of course," Clara said, and went back to folding. Alice was not fooled by this. Clara Webb had never been fooled by anything in her life and did not extend the same courtesy to others. 3 days after the meeting, Alice was in her wheat field assessing the state of the late summer growth when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see Stephen Haskins pull up at her fence line. He was on a bay horse, well kept and steady, the kind of horse a careful man chooses. He pulled up and tipped his hat. "Mrs. Boone, Mr. Haskins." He had, apparently, ridden 3 miles from the eastern spread to tell her that he had spoken with Pete Garrity and Ben Cartwright about organizing a formal petition to the county land office regarding the Duke's water rights claim, and that both men were willing if she was willing to draft the language, because, as Pete Garrity had apparently said with a directness that was to his credit, she was the only one who had actually done the research. Alice looked at him for a moment across the fence line. He was sitting easy in the saddle, not performing comfort but genuinely comfortable, a man who spent most of his life on horseback and had made peace with it. "You rode 3 miles to tell me that," she said. "I did. You could have sent a note." "I could have," he agreed. "I thought it was the kind of thing better said in person." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the wheat, which was doing adequately if not spectacularly, the way things on this farm tended to do adequate because she worked them carefully, not spectacular because 40 acres with 1 adult and 1 aged mule and 2 small children had natural limits. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Haskins?" she asked. "I have been in this field since dawn and I was going to stop soon regardless." He looked at her carefully, as though he understood that the offer meant something and did not want to respond to it as though it meant more or less than it did. "I would appreciate that," he said. "Thank you." He tied his horse to the fence post and followed her across the yard to the small house, which was a good house for what it was: solid, practical, kept with the particular care of someone who understood that a thing worth having was worth maintaining. The porch needed new boards on the right side, something Alice had been meaning to address since spring but had not yet had time for, and she was aware of this as they crossed it, aware in the way you are when you see something familiar through different eyes. Eli was behind the house working on the problem of a rabbit that had found its way into the kitchen garden, conducting the eviction with the intense diplomatic seriousness that he brought to most things. Me was sitting on the back step with a corn-husk doll, apparently delivering a lecture on some subject of importance to the doll, who was not arguing back. Me looked up at Stephen with the frank appraising stare of a 5-year-old and said, "You are very tall." "I am somewhat tall," Stephen agreed, stopping to address her directly with the same gravity she had offered. "Not exceptionally, just somewhat." Me considered this. Our papa was not tall. "Me," Alice said from the doorway. "I was only saying," me said. "Your mother is right," Stephen told me, gently but not dismissively. "That is a private thing to say to a stranger." "You are not a stranger," me said, with the perfect confidence of a child who has decided something. "Mama said you were decent." Alice, who had walked into the house to manage the coffee, heard this through the open window and closed her eyes briefly. When Stephen came inside, settling onto one of the chairs at the kitchen table with the straightforward ease of a man who was not trying to impress anyone with either his presence or his restraint, the conversation moved into practical territory. They talked about the petition, about the legal precedents Alice had found in a copy of the Kansas statutes she had borrowed from the county courthouse, about the 3 other farmers she thought would sign, and the 2 who probably would not because they were afraid of Harlan Dukes's economic reach. Stephen listened when she spoke. He asked questions that were specific and substantive. When he disagreed, and he did twice on small matters of strategy, he said so directly and explained his reasoning without suggesting that his disagreement was a correction of her fundamental judgment. It was, Alice thought, while she poured the coffee, the most functional conversation she had had with another adult about something that mattered in a very long time. Thomas had been a good man, and she had loved him genuinely. But Thomas had had the tendency of a certain kind of good man to assume that her thinking was a softer version of his own thinking, to receive her ideas with a kind of benevolent modification that turned them into something slightly different before acting on them. She had not resented it when he was alive. She had simply worked around it, as she worked around most things. Having a conversation where her thinking arrived at the other end intact was startling, in a way she could not entirely account for. They drank their coffee and talked for the better part of an hour, and when Stephen stood to leave he thanked her for the coffee and for the legal analysis and said he would speak to Pete Garrity that week. He paused at the door. "I hope you will not think it impertinent," he said, "if I say that what you are doing for those farms is not a small thing. What you are doing takes a particular kind of courage, and I want you to know that at least some of us see it." Alice looked at him in the doorway with the afternoon light beyond him and the yard busy with the sounds of her children and her farm. "It is not courage," she said. "It is necessity." "Those are often the same thing," he replied and stepped off the porch. She watched him ride down the road toward town, the bay horse moving with that good steady gait, until the road bent and he was gone behind the cottonwoods. Then she went back inside and washed the coffee cups and told herself again that this was simply a matter of practical alliance and shared interest and nothing more. It was getting easier, or perhaps harder, to believe that. The county land office responded to the petition 3 weeks later. The response was not a resolution, but a formal request for a hearing, scheduled for October, which meant the water rights question would stretch into the fall. This was better than an outright dismissal, and worse than a decision in their favor. And Alice spent the interim weeks corresponding with the other petitioners, refining the legal arguments, and managing the harvest with the particular focused desperation of a farmer who knows the margin between adequate and catastrophic is measured in days of weather. Stephen came by the farm twice more in those weeks, each time with a practical purpose. Once to deliver a copy of a court decision from the Reno County water case that he thought might be useful as precedent. Once to tell her that Ben Cartwright had found a surveyor's map from 1869 that contradicted one of Dukes's foundational claims about when the upstream diversion had been established. Both times Alice made coffee. Both times they sat at the kitchen table and talked for longer than the practical purpose required. Eli, who had decided that Stephen was acceptable based on the single criterion of Stephen having listened to his extremely detailed account of the Rabbitan Garden situation, without once suggesting that Eli was talking too long, had taken to appearing at the table during these visits and interjecting observations. Stephen received these observations with complete seriousness, engaging Eli's arguments about rabbits and water rights and the general management of the universe as though they merited genuine consideration, which, Alice noted, they frequently did. Me continued to make pronouncements. Clara Webb, who had begun finding reasons to be present at the Boone farm on the days when Stephen visited, which she tracked with a precision that Alice had decided was better not to examine, made no further remarks on the subject, but communicated a continuous commentary through the medium of expression and strategic pot-stirring. The October hearing arrived in a week of cold rain that turned the roads to mud and made the ride to town a matter of grim determination. Alice made it in 2.5 hours on Biscuit, arriving at the county courthouse in Wichita because the dispute had escalated to the county level, which was itself a measure of how seriously the land office was taking the petition, with her documents secured in an oilcloth folder and her hem thoroughly ruined. Stephen arrived 20 minutes later on his bay horse, mud-spattered and steady, with Pete Garrity and Ben Cartwright behind him. They were all there, all the petitioners Alice had identified. Even the two she had thought too afraid of Dukes, they had come. She looked at them assembled in the courthouse foyer and felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite emotion and not quite strategy, but was somewhere in between, the feeling of having built something out of necessity and finding that it had become more solid than you had any reason to expect. Harlan Dukes arrived in a covered carriage with 2 attorneys this time. He did not look at Alice. He looked at the room in the way a man looks at a room when he is calculating the math of it. When he saw the assembled petitioners, all 7 of them present and dry enough and purposeful, something shifted in his calculation, though he gave nothing away in his expression. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Alice presented the legal arguments. She was calm, precise, and systematic, and she had prepared for every counterargument the Duke's attorneys raised because she had spent 3 weeks imagining what she would say if she were on their side. When they quoted the prior appropriation doctrine, she quoted the same doctrine with a different set of dates. When they presented the diversion records, she presented Ben Cartwright's surveyor map, which established that the diversion was 12 years more recent than Dukes had claimed, and therefore could not constitute a prior right superior to the settlers who had arrived in the 1870s. When the Duke's attorney tried to raise a procedural objection to the testimony of Pete Garrity on the grounds that Garrity had no legal training to assess the hydrological implications, Alice stood up and pointed out that Harlan Dukes himself had no legal training either, and that the question before the hearing officer was not one of hydrological expertise, but of documented water usage history, which the assembled farmers had provided in the form of records, receipts, and the sworn testimonies of people who had been using that creek for a decade. The hearing officer, a quiet man from Topeka named Wallace who had seen enough land disputes to be genuinely bored by bluster, asked good questions and took careful notes. At the end of 4 hours, he said he would render a decision within 60 days, that both parties had presented substantial arguments, and that he would be conducting his own review of the land registry and survey records. It was not a victory. It was better than they had come in expecting, and they left the courthouse into the cold October rain with something that was practically indistinguishable from hope. On the ride back to Caldwell Creek, Stephen pulled his bay up alongside Biscuit. The mule looked at the bay with profound lack of enthusiasm. The bay bore this with the patience of a good horse. "You were extraordinary in there," Stephen said. "I was thorough," Alice corrected. "There is a difference." "Is there? Extraordinary implies something beyond ordinary effort. What I did today was the result of ordinary effort applied consistently over a long period of time. Anyone could do it." He was quiet for a moment, their horses moving at the same steady pace through the mud. "Anyone could do it," he said, "but most people don't, and I think you know that." She looked at him sideways, the rain soft on her hat brim, the road long and gray ahead of them. "Why are you not married, Mr. Haskins?" she asked, and then heard herself ask it and was slightly startled by the directness of the question, which had arrived from somewhere below the level of conscious decision. He did not seem startled by it. He considered it with the same attention he gave to everything. "I was engaged once," he said. 9 years ago. She chose someone else about 6 weeks before the wedding. I can't hold it against her. He was a better prospect at the time, better established, more certain. I went west instead of east, which seemed to suggest that stability was not going to be my primary feature for a while." He paused. "After that, I was mostly busy building something out of the cattle operation. Time has a way of passing faster than you intend." "And now?" Alice asked, and then said, "You do not have to answer that." "I know," he said. "Now I think I might have a clearer sense of what I am looking for than I did at 23. They rode for a while in comfortable silence, the rain easing to a mist. "Why are you asking?" Stephen said, and there was something in his voice that was careful in the way that careful things are careful, not cautious but precise, not guarded but respectful. "I was curious," Alice said. "All right," he said. They rode the rest of the way in that easy quiet, and when they reached the turning where his road went east and hers went south, he pulled up and she pulled up and they looked at each other in the gray afternoon. "Alice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it with a sensation like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward from the center. He noticed that he had said it, too, she could see that, and he did not take it back or apologize for it. He simply let it stand there in the air between them. "Be careful on the road home," she said. "The mud will be worse south of the grove." "You too," he said. She rode home to her children and her fire and the 40 acres that were hers, and she sat that night after Eli and me were asleep with a cup of tea at the kitchen table and the lamp burning low, and she allowed herself, carefully and with deliberate honesty, to examine what was happening. She was 28 years old. She had been a wife and was now a widow. She had 2 children and a farm and a legal dispute, and approximately no time for anything that was not urgent and necessary. She also had, she admitted to herself in the quiet of the kitchen, feelings that were currently being neither urgent nor practical about a man named Stephen Haskins, and those feelings were not going to resolve themselves by being ignored, which was what she had been attempting for the past 6 weeks. She finished her tea and went to bed and did not resolve anything, but she stopped pretending the question didn't exist, which was at least a more honest position. 3 weeks after the hearing, on a Saturday when the weather had turned to that clean cold that precedes a Kansas winter, Stephen appeared at her farm not with documents or information, but with a length of good lumber and 2 cans of paint, and an offer to fix the porch boards that had been needing it since spring. He explained this with the particular offhandedness of someone who is offering a thing and is prepared for it to be refused without damage to either party. Alice stood in her doorway and looked at the lumber and looked at him. "You brought paint," she said. "The wood needs sealing. Once it's sealed, it might as well be painted. That is a great deal of initiative, Mr. Haskins." "I know how to use a hammer," he said, "and I noticed the boards when I was here last. I thought—" He paused. "I should have asked first. If you would rather I didn't know," she said. "I would rather you did. I have been meaning to do it for 8 months and I haven't had the time." She stepped back from the door. "I'll make breakfast first." They ate breakfast. She made eggs and biscuits, and Eli and me ate with the cheerful efficiency of children who do not yet understand that breakfast can be ordinary. And then Stephen went to work on the porch while Alice attended to the morning's farm chores. Eli, who had clearly decided that Stephen was now a permanent feature of acceptable reality, followed him out and appointed himself assistant, handing tools with the focused sincerity of a child who takes assistance seriously. Me sat on the step that was not being worked on and provided commentary. Alice moved through her morning feeding the chickens, checking the cows, assessing the state of the kitchen garden before the first hard frost, with a physical awareness of Stephen's presence in her yard that she recognized, honestly, as the particular consciousness of someone who is paying attention to a person in the way that you pay attention to a person when they have begun to matter. By midday, the porch boards were replaced, and the first coat of paint was drying in the cold air, and they ate lunch together at the kitchen table, leftover beans and cornbread, and talked about the hearing and the water rights and what would happen if Wallace's decision went against them, and about cattle prices and the coming winter, and whether the wheat yield had been adequate by Alice's analysis. It was the kind of conversation that wanders between practical and personal in the way of people who have become comfortable enough with each other that the boundary between those territories is no longer a wall but simply a low fence. At some point Stephen said, "Your children are remarkable." Alice looked at him. "They are," she said. "Eli has his father's sense of justice. Me has," she paused, "me has her own sense of everything which is distinct from anyone else's. She told me this morning that my horse's name should be Captain because he has a commanding face. She is 5 years old. She may not be wrong about the horse." Alice laughed. It surprised her a little, the laughter, the genuine fullness of it, because she did not laugh easily anymore. She had laughed easily before Thomas died, and then the year after his death had been a year of such relentless practical difficulty that laughter had become a luxury she kept forgetting to spend. She was getting better at remembering. Stephen looked at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has seen something he wanted to see and doesn't know quite what to do with the wanting of it. "Alice," he said carefully. "Yes," she said equally carefully. "I would like to—" He stopped, looked at his hands, looked up. "I would like to call on you properly, if that is something you would consider." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear Eli explaining something at length to an audience that appeared to be the remaining chickens. Me was presumably with him, which meant the only witnesses to this moment were the beans and the cornbread. "Mr. Haskins," Alice said, "you have been calling on me for 6 weeks. Not properly," he said. "Not with your knowing that's what it was. I didn't want to presume, or make it awkward between us when we had practical matters to attend to. But I also don't think it's fair to either of us to keep pretending I keep showing up about documents." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes and did not look away and did not fill the silence with anything. "I would consider it," she said. He exhaled slowly, and she could see the steadiness he had been maintaining relax slightly into something more natural. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. The second coat of paint went on the porch boards that afternoon, and when he left in the early evening, just before the cold fully settled in, he tipped his hat to her on the newly painted porch, and she stood in her doorway with the lamp behind her and the cold sky above and watched him ride east. She did not tell herself it was nothing this time. They courted through November and into December in the particular way of two people who have already established a working respect for each other, and are now discovering that the emotional territory beyond that is both more complicated and more rewarding than the practical territory that preceded it. He came to the farm twice a week, always at times that were sensible rather than impulsive, and she appreciated the regularity of it, the way it fit into her life rather than disrupting it. They took walks on the days when the weather allowed it, talking about everything and nothing, the conversation moving between ideas and memories and the texture of daily life. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Ohio 7 years ago, the youngest of 3 brothers, with enough savings from 5 years of hired ranch work to put a down payment on the eastern acreage. She learned that he read more than most people expected. He had a shelf of books in the ranch house that he was slightly self-conscious about admitting to, until she told him about the 2 crates of books she had brought from Missouri when she and Thomas had come west. She learned that he was patient with animals and children, and the unpredictable machinery of weather in a way that was not resignation but genuine equanimity. He learned, in turn, that she had been a schoolteacher before marrying Thomas, which explained the precision of her thinking and the particular way she constructed arguments. He learned that she had opinions about almost everything, and expressed them with a directness that she had learned to calibrate for most rooms, but that she abandoned entirely when she was comfortable, and that her being comfortable with him was something she had apparently decided somewhere in the process of their becoming friends. He learned that she cried at the wrong moments, at practical difficulties rarely, but at moments of unexpected beauty frequently, and she found this embarrassing, and he found it something he had no word for but that registered somewhere in him as important. December brought the Wallace decision from the county land office. The decision arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to Alice's door by the county mail rider, and she sat down on the newly painted porch in her coat despite the cold and opened it. The finding was substantially in favor of the petitioners. Wallace had reviewed the survey records and found that the Duke's upstream diversion had been established in 1874, not 1871 as claimed, placing it after the establishment of 3 of the downstream properties and making the prior appropriation argument legally untenable for the purposes of the contested restriction. The downstream water drawing rights of the petitioning properties were affirmed, with a regulated framework for usage in years of drought that applied equally to all parties. It was a victory, a real one, complete enough to matter. Alice sat on her porch and read the decision twice and then looked out at her wheat field, brown and harvested and waiting for spring, and felt the release of something she had been holding for months. The sustained tension of a fight she had not known she could win but had pursued anyway because the alternative was to not pursue it, and she had never been able to choose that. She thought, with a warmth she did not try to contain or explain, "I need to tell Stephen." She sent Eli on Biscuit to deliver a note to the Haskins ranch. Eli was delighted by this commission and executed it with the gravity of a diplomat, and Stephen arrived at the farm by early afternoon, and when she showed him the letter his expression moved through several things in quick succession, ending at something that was uncomplicated and genuine and warming. "You did this," he said. "We did this. Alice, you built the entire case. You did the research. You wrote the petition. You presented the arguments." He looked at her directly. "Take the credit." She looked down at the letter and then up at him, and something in her was unexpectedly moved by the simplicity of being told to take credit for what she had done by someone who meant it. "All right," she said softly. "I did this." "You did," he said, and the warmth in his voice was so steady and certain that she felt it the way you feel warmth when you have been cold for a long time and had stopped noticing. He was standing close to her on the porch, close enough that if either of them moved slightly the distance between them would be something different from what it currently was. The December air was crisp and bright. The farm was quiet. Eli was still conducting some complicated procedure with Biscuit, who was unimpressed, and me was inside with Clara, who had appeared mid-morning with a pie and the expression of someone who had decided that Tuesdays were a good day for pie. "Stephen," Alice said. "Yes," he said, in that same careful tone she had come to associate with moments between them that mattered. "I would like it very much if you would." She stopped, started again. "I have not done this in a long time. Not courting specifically, but the act of wanting something for myself, something beyond the farm and the children. That has been complicated to find my way back to." "I know," he said gently. "I am not saying it to explain a hesitation. I am saying it because I want you to understand what it means that I'm—" She met his eyes. "That I'm not hesitating." The look on his face was something she would remember for a long time, the way it changed and steadied in the same moment, the way it looked like a man arriving somewhere he had been trying to reach. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood on her painted porch in the December light holding hands, and it was not a dramatic thing in the way that dramatic things usually are. It was quiet and solid and real, the way the best things tend to be. "I'm not hesitating either," he said. Clara Webb, visible through the kitchen window in a way that suggested she had positioned herself there deliberately, executed a small and private gesture of triumph, and then went back to cutting her pie with perfect composure. Christmas came to Caldwell Creek with a light snowfall that made the town beautiful in the particular way that towns on the Kansas plain are beautiful in winter. The wide sky gone to deep blue, the white land stretching in every direction, the warmth of the houses pressing back against the cold from within. The Boone farm had a tree, a small cedar that Eli had located and cut himself with a handsaw, requiring 2 hours and considerable determination, decorated with the ornaments Alice had carried from Missouri, small painted wooden shapes and strings of dried berries. Stephen came for Christmas dinner. He brought a length of good wool for Me's coat, which she needed, and which Clara Webb had quietly communicated through the reliable network of small-town information, and a book on natural history for Eli that Eli immediately opened and did not put down for the rest of the day, even during dinner, until Alice made him put it beside his plate with the firm parental instruction that books were not at the table, which Eli received with the expression of a person being asked to briefly suspend gravity. Alice made a roast chicken and cornbread dressing, and a dried apple pie that came out better than she expected. They ate at the kitchen table, all 4 of them. Clara had gone to her nephew's family for the holiday, and it was ordinary and warm and good in a way that Alice had not allowed herself to miss, because missing it had seemed like something she could not afford. After dinner, when the children were occupied, Eli with his book, Me with a new doll that Stephen had brought, a simple cloth doll with embroidered features that Me had immediately named and assigned a complex personal history to Stephen, and Alice sat by the fire with coffee, and talked quietly in the way of people who have reached the part of knowing each other where silences are companionable rather than uncertain. "What do you want for next year?" Stephen asked. "Practically, or however you want to answer." She looked at the fire. "A better wheat yield than this year. Some resolution on the fence line on the southern boundary. There's a question about whether the marker is correctly positioned that I've been meaning to address. A new harness for Biscuit because the current one has a crack in the main strap that I've patched twice and shouldn't patch a third time." She paused, and she stopped, and he said quietly. She turned from the fire and looked at him. He was watching her with that steady attention that she had come to understand as simply how he looked at things he valued, that full and unhurried regard. "I want this," she said. "Whatever this is becoming, I want more of it." He set his coffee cup down and he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand again, and this time she turned her hand over and held his back. "So do I," he said. They sat by the fire holding hands while the snow came down outside and the children were happy and the house was warm, and Alice Boone thought, "This is a thing I did not expect, and I am glad." January was cold and the farm required the constant vigilance that Kansas winters demand, and there were days when Alice did not see Stephen because the road was impassable and the work on both their operations was relentless. But he sent notes when the mail rider could get through, and twice he sent firewood by way of Pete Garrity's oldest son who was making deliveries to the South Farms anyway, and the wood arrived with a brief note that said only, "The winter is long. Keep warm." As she kept the note. She would not have admitted keeping it for any considerable amount of money, but she kept it folded in the pocket of her house dress, and occasionally was aware of it being there in the way you are aware of something that has weight. February brought a thaw, and with it an invitation. Stephen asked her to accompany him to the church social the following Saturday, which was a public event, the first genuinely public thing he had asked her to. She understood what it meant. In a town of Caldwell Creek size, attending a church social together was a declaration. People would talk. They were already talking, she suspected, because small towns are composed substantially of talking about their inhabitants, but this would be definitive. She accepted. The social was in the church hall, lantern-lit and warm, and Alice arrived on Stephen's arm, which was not something she had done in 4 years, and the physical sensation of it, the steadiness of him, the ease with which he offered his arm and matched her pace was something she had to process in real time without the luxury of privacy. Several people looked, some with approval, some with the particular studied neutrality of people who have opinions they have decided not to express in public. Old Martha Clement, who ran the dry goods store and had the most comprehensive social memory in the county, gave Alice a look that communicated an entire editorial about widows and propriety and the appropriate period of decorum, and Alice returned a look that politely but completely refused to receive the editorial. Sheriff Purdy, who had the grace to be somewhat abashed about the meeting incident, nodded to Alice with an expression that was as close to acknowledgement as she was likely to get from him. She nodded back. She was not the type to hold grudges indefinitely when the matter had been practically resolved. They danced. She had not expected to dance. The social included a fiddle player who created an enthusiastic if not entirely precise sound, but Stephen asked her, and she said yes, and they danced a quadrille with a collection of other couples that included Pete Garrity and his wife and Ben Cartwright dancing with rather more ambition than coordination. Stephen was a decent dancer, better than he let on, and she told him so. "I had 4 years of church socials in Ohio," he said. "You either learn or you endure. And you chose to learn. I tend to." She was aware, dancing with him, of the specific and definite reality of him, the solidness of his hand at her waist, the sureness of his step, the way he kept his attention on her rather than on the room. She was aware, too, of having made a good decision, of this being something she had chosen deliberately, and was glad she had chosen. Clara Webb was at the social and observed everything with the satisfied composure of a woman who believes she has played a meaningful role in events and is too gracious to say so explicitly. Spring arrived, and with it, a conversation that had been building beneath the surface of everything for months. Stephen came to the farm on a warm April morning when the wheat was beginning to green, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just coming into leaf, and there was something different in his manner, not nervous exactly, but with an increased attention to whatever he was going to say. He asked if she wanted to walk to the creek, which they sometimes did, and she said yes. They walked down through the field to the bank, where the water was running clear and lively with the spring thaw, moving over the stones with that steady particular sound that was both constant and always slightly different. "Alice," Stephen said, looking at the creek, and then he turned to look at her instead. "I have been thinking about how to say this for 2 months, and I don't think there is a better way than simply saying it directly." "I prefer direct," she said. "I know," he said with a small smile. "It's one of the things he paused. I love you. I should say that first because it is the thing I mean most, and I don't want to say it after everything else like an explanation. I love you. I have loved you since the meeting, I think, or somewhere in the weeks after it. I love how you think. I love how you carry yourself. I love how you are with your children. I love how you treat the things you are responsible for, the farm, the legal question, the other farmers, all of it with the same seriousness. I love that you laugh at unexpected moments and that you told Biscuit he was not a fine animal to his face because I think he understood the honesty of it." He stopped. That got away from me slightly. She was looking at him, and she felt something expanding in her chest, a warmth that had been building for months and was now simply present and complete. "I love you too," she said, and it was simple and true, and the simplicity of it was right in the way that right things are right, without needing ornamentation. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, a plain gold band with a small garnet in the center, simple and well chosen, and he held it out to her with the straightforward honesty that was characteristic of him in everything. "Will you marry me?" he said. "This farm and my acreage together would be something substantial, and I know you care about that, and I want you to know I have thought about what makes practical sense. But mostly I am asking because I cannot imagine the rest of my life without you in it, and I don't think practical sense and love should be treated as separate arguments when they agree." She took the ring from him and held it in her hand for a moment, looking at it. The garnet was the color of old wine, deep and warm. "Yes," she said. "Stephen, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and they stood by the creek in the April sunshine, with the water moving past them and the willows trailing their new leaves in the current. And he kissed her for the first time, a real kiss, unhurried and serious, his hands gentle at her face. And she reached up and held onto the front of his jacket because she needed something to hold onto, not from instability, but from the force of finally letting herself fully want something again without conditions or apology. When they walked back to the house, Eli saw them from the fence where he had been working on his ongoing study of the local bird population using a notebook and one of Thomas's old pencils. He looked at them. He looked at the ring. He looked at Stephen with an expression of 7-year-old seriousness. "Are you going to be our father?" he asked Stephen. Stephen crouched down to be at Eli's level. "That would be your decision as much as anyone's," he said. "I would like to be in your life. What I am called is something we can work out over time if that's all right." Eli considered this with great care. "You could be father," he said finally. "Papa was papa. Father is different." "That could be you." "If you want that," Stephen said, "I would be honored." Eli nodded with the decisive confidence of someone who has completed an analysis. "It is logical," he said, and went back to his bird notebook. Me, who had appeared from the direction of the garden with earth on her hands and an expression of maximum alertness, looked at the ring and then at Stephen and then at her mother. "I told you," she said, and went back to the garden. "What did she tell you?" Stephen asked Alice, bewildered. "I have no idea," Alice said, "but whatever it was, she is certain she was right about it." They were married in June, in the Caldwell Creek church, on a day of warm sun and a soft breeze from the southwest that moved through the open church windows and made the service feel like an outdoor thing even from within. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from the good blue fabric she had been saving without fully acknowledging what she was saving it for, and she carried wildflowers from the creek bank that Me had picked at dawn with absolute dedication to the project. The church was full. The petitioning farmers and their families came, Pete Garrity and Ben Cartwright among them. Clara Webb sat in the second row and cried with the forthright openness of someone who feels that tears on appropriate occasions require no explanation. Even Sheriff Purdy came, cleaned up and marginally less awkward than usual, which was his version of making amends. Eli walked his mother down the aisle, which he did with the composed dignity of a child who has taken the responsibility with complete seriousness. Me was the flower girl, and scattered petals in a pattern that suggested she had specific artistic intentions, rather than simply following convention. When Stephen took Alice's hands at the altar, he looked at her the way he had looked at her at that first meeting in the feed store, with that full, unhurried attention that saw her. And she looked back at him with everything she had, all of it. The farm and the children and the water rights and the painted porch and the coffee in the mornings and the walks by the creek and the feeling of his hand in hers and the particular quality of a man who listened without interrupting, who made space for her thinking, who loved her the way she needed to be loved, completely and without requiring her to be less than she was. "I do," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and full. The party afterward was held at the Boone farm, the Haskins Boone farm, as it was beginning to be called, because their properties were now combined by law and by the practical logic of running two operations as one. And it lasted until the long June evening finally closed into dark, and there was music and food and children running in the yard and lanterns in the cottonwoods, and it was one of those evenings that a person recognizes as they are living it, knowing that they will carry it forward, that it will remain clear when other things have blurred. Stephen and Alice stood at the edge of the yard late in the evening, the party continuing warmly behind them, and looked out at the field and the creek beyond it and the sky full of stars above the Kansas plain. "It's a good farm," he said. "It's a good life," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood there together in the June dark with their children's voices bright behind them. The years that followed were full in every sense, full of work and difficulty and joy, and the specific satisfactions of a life built by people who know what they want and are willing to tend it. The combined acreage became something substantial, not wealthy by the standard of men like Harlan Dukes, but solid and growing. The wheat operation expanding in the South fields while the cattle operation held steady in the East. They hired 2 hands by the second year, young men who were treated fairly and paid properly, and who stayed because they had found a place that operated by principles they could respect. Harlan Dukes, his water rights claim defeated, and his economic consolidation plans disrupted, eventually sold 3 of his northernmost parcels and reduced his local operation. He never became a figure of goodwill in the community, but he became a smaller figure which was nearly as good. The small farms south of the creek persisted. Pete Garrity expanded his pig operation. Ben Cartwright's mill had its best year in 1885. The landscape Alice had fought for continued to be a landscape of many small livelihoods rather than one large consolidation, and that was not nothing, and she knew it. Eli grew into a boy of extraordinary seriousness, and then a young man of considerable promise, his father's sense of justice married to his mother's precision. By 1887, when he was 12, he was helping manage the farm's accounts with a reliability that exceeded several adults. Me grew into a girl who made up her own mind about everything and pursued her conclusions with a cheerful absence of doubt that regularly delighted and occasionally alarmed her parents. She could ride better than any of the neighbor boys by the time she was 9, and had decided by 10 that she was going to be a school teacher, which Alice noted with a private and complex emotion, being one herself. In the summer of 1884, Alice discovered she was expecting a child. She told Stephen on a quiet Sunday morning with the directness she brought to important things, and he looked at her with an expression that was so purely glad that she felt it in her chest. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the bedroom of the combined farmhouse that they had extended in the fall, a healthy and emphatic boy who announced his arrival with a volume suggesting he intended to be heard clearly and immediately. They named him James Thomas Haskins Thomas for Alice's first husband, because it was right to honor him, and James for Stephen's father. He was, as Stephen noted the first evening, regarding him with the dazed sincerity of a man encountering something that has exceeded his previous experience of wonder, considerably louder than I expected. "He takes after me," Alice said, from the bed, tired and warm and profoundly herself. "He takes after you," Stephen agreed, and his voice was full of everything, all of it. Every year in conversation and walked mile and argued legal point and coffee cup and winter note and wildflower and walk by the creek, everything that had built them into what they were. Eli, permitted to see his new brother the following morning, assessed him with a critical eye and declared him adequate, which from Eli was essentially a standing ovation. Me held James for 5 minutes with the intense and proprietary care of a person claiming a thing they have decided is fundamentally theirs, then looked up at her mother. "He smells very new," she said. "All babies do," Alice told her. "I like it," Me said. Clara Webb arrived that afternoon with 3 pies and stayed for a week and was essential in every way, which was true of Clara Webb in all things. The water rights victory continued to matter in practical terms as the years went on. The regulated framework that Wallace had established set a precedent that was referenced in 2 subsequent land disputes in the county, both of which resolved in favor of the smaller properties. Alice corresponded occasionally with a women's land rights advocate in Topeka, who had heard about the case through the county land office, and was compiling examples of women successfully defending property claims in Kansas courts. She contributed a detailed written account of the Caldwell Creek case, which was included in a pamphlet distributed to women homesteaders across the state. This pleased her in a way she found difficult to entirely articulate, but that was real. She had done something that mattered beyond herself, beyond her farm, beyond even her children. She had stood in a room and spoken truth and had been heard, and the consequences of that had rippled outward in ways she continued to discover years later. In 1886, Stephen was asked to run for county commissioner. He discussed it with Alice for 3 evenings before deciding, and the discussions were genuine. He wanted her analysis, not her permission, and he told her so, which she appreciated. She told him she thought he should run and that she thought he would be good at it, and that she was not interested in managing the farm alone again, so if he won he would need to hire a third hand and come home for supper. He ran. He won by 11 votes in an election where the margin surprised everyone. He served 2 terms, during which he was known as the commissioner who actually read the documents before the meetings, and who occasionally said something that the room had not thought to say, but that turned out to be the right thing. Alice attended several of the county commissioner meetings in the capacity of an interested citizen, which no one could formally object to, and on 2 occasions she addressed the body on matters relevant to farm policy and water usage. By the 2nd year, no one attempted to talk over her. It had been tried once, by a commissioner from the Northern District who had not been adequately briefed on the subject of Alice Haskins and what happened when you talked over Alice Haskins, and the resulting correction had been, by general consensus, instructive. The farm grew. The children grew. James turned out to be a child of enormous physical energy and very loud opinions, suggesting he had indeed inherited the relevant maternal traits. He was followed in the spring of 1888 by a daughter, their 2nd daughter named Ruth Clara, with the Clara added in honor of the woman who had been making pies and providing essential support since before either Stephen or Alice could fully remember the farm without her presence. Clara Webb, informed of the naming at a Sunday dinner where she had no expectation of it, was briefly silent in a way that was entirely unlike her, and then said, with her eyes bright, "Well, that is a perfectly sensible name for a sensible child," and went back to her pie. But she kept one hand on the table, and Alice held it for a moment, and nothing else needed to be said. Ruth Clara Haskins proved in her first months to be a child of philosophical equanimity, watching the chaos of her household, Eli reading, me lecturing, James conducting his ongoing physical investigations of the world with an expression of patient interest, as though she were taking careful notes. "She reminds me of you," Alice told Stephen one evening, watching Ruth in her cradle. "The way she just watches everything and takes it in." "You watch everything," Stephen said. "I watch and then I speak," Alice said. "She watches and considers, that's yours." He looked at her sideways and she smiled back, and they were 34 and 38, and had 4 children and a combined farm, and a decade of water rights history behind them and a full life ahead, and it was warm and lit by lamplight and completely real. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, Stephen and Alice walked to the creek in the long summer light. The children were old enough now that Eli and me could be trusted with the younger 2 for an hour, and they had learned that evening walks to the creek were a protected time in the household, respected and preserved by the children with the intuition of children who understand when something matters to their parents. The creek was running easy and clear. The willows had grown considerably from when Alice had first walked this land as a widow with a mule and 40 acres, and a grief she had carried forward by sheer force of will. The sky to the west was going to that deep copper that she had associated since her first evening with him, that evening in the feed store doorway after the meeting, when he had untied Biscuit and looked up at her in the long light with the feeling of something beginning. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. When you stood up in that meeting, she said, and told Purdy to let me speak. He was going to let you talk until the room forgot you were there, Stephen said. I couldn't sit still for it. You could have, though, she said. A lot of men would have, most men did. I know, he said. She looked at him. What made you different? He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to things she asked him directly. I listened, he said. I think that's all it was. I listened to you in the meeting before you even said a word. I saw you sit down in the middle of the room and I watched you raise your hand and hold it there with a patience that was something else altogether, and he paused. I was paying attention to you, and most of the room wasn't, and I thought, that is where the truth is. That is the person in this room who actually knows what she is talking about, and the idea of that being ignored was intolerable to me. She was quiet for a moment, the creek moving over its stones. "You know what changed for me," she said, "that evening after the meeting, when you walked me to Biscuit." "What?" "You said I didn't need you to finish my sentences, not as a grand statement of principle, just as a fact you had observed and acted on." She looked at him. I had not been thought of that way before, even by people who loved me. I had been thought of as someone who needed things explained to her or completed for her or helped toward her conclusions, not unkindly, but consistently. She paused. "You thought of me differently from the first moment, and I didn't know what to do with that. And now," he said. She reached out and took his hand by the creek in the evening light. "Now I know," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the simple and particular way he had of making small gestures carry their full weight. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back. They stood by the creek as the copper sky deepened, and the first stars appeared above the Kansas plain, and the farm was behind them and the children were there, and the years ahead were full and uncircumscribed in theirs. And Alice Boone, Alice Haskins now, in law and in name, though she was both and always would be both, held her husband's hand and watched the water move over the stones and thought about all the mornings she had not known this would be possible. All the days she had carried on because she had no alternative but to carry on, and how carrying on had brought her here, to this bank, to this man, to this life that fit around her like something made to measure. The water kept moving. The stars came out one by one. The evening was full of the sounds of a Kansas summer insects and the distant cry of a nighthawk and the soft breathing of a land that had held people on its surface for a very long time and would hold them for a very long time more. "We should go back," she said. "James will have invented a new problem by now." "He definitely has," Stephen said, "and me will have solved it in a way that creates two other problems." "Almost certainly." She laughed and he laughed with her, and they turned back toward the farm with their hands still joined, walking through the summer grass in the growing dark, heading home to their children and their fire, and the full particular shape of the life they had made together, the life that had begun in a dusty feed store on a September afternoon in 1882, when a woman raised her hand and held it there with extraordinary patience, and a man saw it and listened and stood up. That was where it had started. A woman who would not be made invisible, and a man who refused to pretend she was. The rest was everything. Ruth Clara grew into a quiet girl with her father's eyes and her mother's certainty, and by the time she was 4, she had learned to make her point with a single steady look that people found difficult to argue with, which was, Alice said, the most efficient form of her grandmother's whole philosophy. James, at 5, decided he wanted to be a cowboy, a real one, with cattle drives and horses and the whole tremendous outdoor freedom of it. And Stephen did not discourage him, because James would make a fine cowboy, but he also started teaching him to read maps and understand land records, because a man who loves the land, Stephen had learned, needs to understand how to keep it. Eli, at 17, was already corresponding with a law school in Kansas City, and had written a letter of inquiry that Alice had read with an emotion she could only describe as completely overwhelming pride. He would be a lawyer, she thought, and a good one, the kind who understood that legal arguments were not abstractions but the shape of people's actual lives. Me, at 15, was teaching younger children in the church on Sundays, with an authority and warmth that the actual schoolteacher had begun to recognize as professional quality, and the plans for her future were taking a shape that pleased her more each year. And on a summer evening in 1893, 11 years after the meeting in the feed store, Alice Haskins stood on the porch of her expanded farmhouse, the porch that had been repaired and painted and repaired again, the boards worn now with the honest use of a life lived fully on them, and watched her husband come in from the east field on his bay horse, which was now an older horse but still steady and good, still chosen by a careful man for precisely those qualities. He saw her on the porch and lifted his hand, and she lifted hers, and the evening was gold and wide, and the children's voices were somewhere in the yard, and the wheat was green in the field, and the creek was moving over its stones in the distance, carrying the water that was theirs by law and by right, and by the effort of a woman who had walked into a room and spoken the truth until someone listened. Stephen dismounted at the fence and walked across the yard, and she came down off the porch to meet him, and when he reached her he kissed her in the yard in the evening light the way he always did, unhurried and sure, and she held on to him the way she always did, completely and without conditions. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. "The east pasture is better than I thought. We might add another dozen head next spring. I'll look at the numbers this evening." "I know you will," he said, with that warmth that was 11 years settled and still warm. They went inside together, into the light and the voices and the smell of supper, and the door closed behind them, and the farm held them in the way that a good farm holds the life that has been lived on it solidly and without condition, and for as long as they would tend it, which would be a long time, a very long time.